Welcome everybody joining me in our webinar about the basic principles of GMP. First of all, to just give you the big picture, this webinar is planned as really a basic introduction in the main parts of existing GMP guidelines. We want to, first of all, just to give you a basic understanding, what does the abbreviation mean? Then I'm going to give you a short overview about where does it all come from. Then there will be a part about, or I'm going to just give you just a brief picture about the different guidelines in different countries and where GMP is. There will be a really brief and short overview about the most important parts, at least in our view, of the existing GMP guidelines. There we'll focus on the FDA CGMP guidelines and the European OIDRA Lex GMP guidelines. And finally, I will give you just a brief outlook on what we are planning in our next webinar in this series, which will focus then on ATMP, which stands for Advanced Therapies, Medicinal Products. And as Martina already mentioned before, at the end there will be the opportunity for a quick and short question and answer session. So let's move on. We got a quite packed agenda. What does GMP stand for? Well, this is really easy. Of course, it's the good manufacturing practice. And if you look at the GMP guidelines, especially in the United States, you will find the abbreviation CGMP, which stands for Current Good Manufacturing Practices. But these abbreviations basically mean more or less the same. Where does it all come from? It doesn't come out of nothing. Of course, there is a history of GMP, and this history starts, as I will tell you shortly, in the early 20th century. And what we are seeing in regards of this history is a classic example of a reactive government. So there have been adverse events, there have been catastrophic events, and this led to the implementation of certain guidelines. And this is what I'm going to show you right now. I'd like to start with these two pictures. On the left-hand side, this is the title of the back then Collier's magazine, which was a so-called muck-raking magazine. Today you would call this investigative journalism. And they, in 1906, had this picture on the title. And there was an article series which featured the Great American Fraud, as they called it, patent medicine. Patent medicine basically was just quackery, and one of these patent medicines was back then some Alexia, or a liquid which was called liquizone, and which was marketed as antibiotic, but which contained, since there was basically no regulation at all, 98% water and a little bit sulfuric or sulfurous acid. And on the right-hand side, there's the box of radiodine pills, which were marketed as containing the strength of iron and the energy of radium, which is, of course, atomic energy, so radioactive radiation, which is pretty harmful, as you all know. But on the package, it says, carry this, and I'm going to show you in a second, carry this package with you always. This was simply not regulated, and as you might all know, this led to injuries and maybe even deadly radiation events. So obviously was the need for further guidelines and for laws which govern not only medicines or drugs but also food. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published a novel which was called The Jungle, which basically and mainly covered the work in slaughterhouses in the Chicago area. And this led to a public uprising due to the conditions which their meat was produced. And this public uprising then helped in 1906, once again, to install the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was nothing else than just a labeling act. This act mandated the manufacturer of drugs and food to correctly label this act. But it not only had a part upon labeling, it was also, and it is also considered as the birth of, which is now more or less the modern FDA. Nevertheless, there were several flaws because therapeutic claims were not limited and it did not require pre-market inspections or approval. But with this act, it was basically the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. It was initially the Bureau of Chemistry, which regulated the food and safety, but in 1927, and this was in the aftermath of the Food and Drug Act, the Bureau was reorganized into the Food, Drug and Insecticide Administration and the Bureau of Chemistry and Soils, and finally in 1930 the FDIA, the Food, Drug and Insecticide Administration, was renamed FDA. But still, there was no GMP, and it took another few catastrophes until the now modern or GMP guidelines were installed. One of them was the Alexia sulfonamide incident. A company marketed this Alexia sulfonamide as an antibiotic, but unfortunately they used DEG, diethylene glycol, which is poisonous to humans and other mammals, as solvent for the sulfonamide. To make this elixir more tasteful, they added raspberry flavoring, but still, since diethylene glycol was used as a solvent, this led to the poisoning of roughly 100 people and the death of roughly 100 people in the United States. And in the aftermath, the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act passed, which is now still the base of the existing drug regulation in the United States. There has been funny enough, if you want to put it like this, there has been a trial in court because the company, Messenger, pharmaceutical company, violated the law, but the violation of the law was not to kill 100 people, but to market this so-called elixir as an elixir, since it contained no alcohol. And back then, if you want to sell an elixir, it has to contain alcohol. So they were not sued for killing more than 100 people, but for false marketing of this so-called elixir. Anyway, no real GMP guidelines. Which brings us to the next variant. This is Phenobarbital. Phenobarbital is used to treat and still used to treat in developing countries epileptic seizures, trouble in sleeping, anxiety, and so on and so forth. But it has side effects, for instance, sedation and hypnosis. And if you overdose it, it leads to the depression of body systems and finally to pulmonary edema and death. Where did this happen? In another short sulfur drug, sulfathiazole, which was once again used as an antimicrobial substance. But in 1941, the sulfathiazole disaster led to the death of over 300 people because the manufacturer, Winthrop's company, didn't follow good manufacturing practices. The sulfathiazole drug was contaminated with this phenobarbital because they did not clean up they did not follow the manufacturing standards. So the people which took the sulfathiazole were poisoned with the contamination through phenobarbital. And this finally prompted the FDA to require detailed controls in the production, and not only at Winthrop's company, but of course also throughout the industry. And this was the approach which became finally, but not yet, not in 1941, the basis for production control standards for all pharmaceuticals. But as I have mentioned, this was hailed as the birth of the GMPs, but still there won't be regulation issues for the next 23 years. And it took another disaster, and this time this drug, to finally install GMP guidelines. What's this? This is thalidomide or thalidomide, which is known in Europe as Contergan, and you all know the Contergan disaster, which led to birth defects of several hundred of children in the 60s in Europe. But in 1956, Richardson Merrill in the United States applied to sell this thalidomide Contergan as Kevadon, which was the name which should have been the name in the United States. But back then, Francis Kelsey, which was a new FDA inspector, rejected this application, and this was quite against quite against the pushing of the pharmaceutical company, which of course wanted the drug to be approved. Frances Kelsey had a background in fetal safety since she worked with malaria drugs in the 1940s, and she rejected it since there was no safety data on the mechanisms of action as required in the Act of 1983. And despite political pressure and 6 reapplications, Kelsey refused to approve the drug. And as we know right now, this was, of course, life-saving, let's put it like this, for many American children or US American children. And in the aftermath of the tragedy in Europe, the so-called Kefauver-Harris Amendment was finally installed as an amendment to the Food, Drug and Cosmetics Act. And this amendment required the manufacturers prove the efficacy of the drugs before they go to the market, and they report serious side effects. It required for the first time that clinical trials have to show the efficacy of the drug, and these clinical trials have to be adequate and well controlled. And something which is important nowadays more and more, the study subjects would be required to give their informed consent. Then it gave the FDA 180 days to approve new drugs, and it required the approval before the new drugs could be marketed in the United States. Another point of this amendment was that the FDA should reevaluate the efficacy of drugs which have already been approved between 1938 and 1962. The FDA was then in charge for the control of the advertising of prescription drugs, and it also controlled the marketing of generic drugs to keep them from being sold as expensive medications under new trade names. And last but not least, it allowed the FDA to set good manufacturing practices for industry and mandated regular inspections of production facilities. So then there was GMP. And it was not only in the United States around this time in the late 60s where these regulations were issued, but worldwide. For instance, in 1963, there was a resolution by the World Health Assembly on drug safety and monitoring, which reaffirmed the need for early actions in regard to adverse drug reactions. 1965, the European Union issued the Council Directive 6565 EEC, which laid the base for the European GMP regulations. There was another law and an act of parliament in the United Kingdom, in 1968. So in the late 60s and the early 70s, we saw a plethora of regulations in regards of drug manufacturing practices. And it's not only there is not only the WHO, there's not only the European Union, there is also, for instance, the ICH, International Committee on Harmonizations, which got a Q7. There are GMPs formulated by the Australian Department of Health. Health Canada has issued guidelines, but it's not only the Western world, also in Japan there are GMP guidelines. And we do see more and more other countries issuing guidelines how to manufacture drugs under good manufacturing practices. So now we have the guidelines, but what's in there? I will come back, actually it's everything, and this I will show you later. What I'm going to show you right now is at least a brief overview of a few of the basic and main parts, at least to our understanding of these guidelines, and what's in there. This could be only, once again said, a brief and basic overview, since going deeper into it would just be way beyond the scope of this webinar. Guidelines, or these guidelines, govern the existence of a training department. The buildings and facilities are described in there and how they have to be set up. Quality control departments and laboratories are described and how this has to be set up. QA departments. There has to be a regulatory affairs department, and not only the production but also the development is regulated under GMP guidelines. And if you have the final product, it's described how you have to package and label it. Validation, it's one of the big points in these guidelines. And finally, receiving and shipping is also something which is covered by the guideline. And what we have done now is that we have concentrated on the two major ones, so the FDA CGMP guidelines and the Eudralex guidelines, which are in place in the European Union. And first of all, coming back to the personnel, both guidelines state that the personnel has to be trained and experienced. It's not only training for whatever you want, the training should also be tailored to the function of the person. The training has to be conducted by persons who are qualified, so before you can do any training, you should, of course, make sure that the person who is the trainer is able to do this training. And finally, there has to be an adequate number of qualified personnel supervising the manufacturing, processing, packaging of products. So if you have these trained people, if they have been trained by a qualified person, you have to use these people to manufacture, process, package, and hold the products. Buildings, facilities, and equipment. Basically, it's more or less common sense which is written in there if you think it to the end. Of course, the buildings and facilities should minimize the risk of contamination of the material and products. They should be maintained carefully, cleaned and disinfected. This has to be, of course, been proven in records, and I will come back to this later. Right now, it's more and more important to look at the complete process of manufacturing, so the environment which is provided should ensure quality and a maximum protection against animals and other pests. And which is something of quite important, in my opinion, it should protect unauthorized personnel from entering the manufacturing suites. Equipment used in the manufacturing, processing, packaging, or holding shall be of appropriate design, adequate size, and suitably located. What could this mean? For instance, the equipment should have inert surfaces. This is something which you will see quite often, like these stainless steel tanks for manufacturing, because stainless steel is one of the materials which provides these inert surfaces. It should be maintained carefully, cleaned and disinfected on a regular basis. And once again, if you don't write it down, it has never happened, and this is something I will come back to this later. Records should be kept of the maintenance and cleaning and so on and so forth. One main part of the manufacturing is the quality control unit. Both guidelines state that there has to be a quality control department in place. It is of utmost importance that this department is independent from the manufacturing. This department has to check that all relevant factors during the production, for instance, production conditions, in-process testing, and so on and so forth, are in compliance with the final specification. And last but not least, since there is not only good manufacturing practice, but also, for instance, good laboratory practice, the quality control department has to follow this good laboratory practice, which is mentioned in the FDA CGMP guideline. But you will find this references to the quality control unit throughout all the FDA CGMP guidelines. But it's not only mentioned in the FDA guideline, it's also mentioned in the Eudralex guideline. It's more or less the same as you see here. But what's especially mentioned in the European guideline is that the department should have access to all relevant documents concerning manufacturing, sampling, testing results, and so on and so forth, and that there should be a long-term stability study of the finished product, which should be tested on a regular basis by the quality control department. And as I have said before, if you don't write it down, it has never been done. Records and reports are really important. You can have the best process ever. If you do not write it down, it will not be accepted. So there has to be an equipment and cleaning log. This is once again the FDA CGMP guideline. The components, drug product containers, closure and labelings should be recorded. There have to be master production and control records in place. But not only there have to be master records, but also each batch has to be, the production of each batch has to be recorded and controlled. Then there should be a production record review. And this has to be done by, of course, the control laboratories, which should definitely record their efforts. And finally, distribution records have to be filled in. This is also covered in the European guideline, but the European guideline has kind of other wordings for it. There has to be a site master file, which is a document that describes the GMP-related activities of the manufacturer. But besides this site master files, there have to be recorded specifications, manufacturing formula, processes, packaging, and so on and so forth. This is an abbreviation you will see quite often. SOPs stands for Standard Order Procedures. These have to be written down and followed, of course, and protocoled. And the European guideline also specifies the record types which have to be done. Records which provide evidence of various actions taken to demonstrate compliance with instructions. A certificate of analysis, and this is something important, provide a summary of testing results on samples of products or materials together with the evaluation for compliance to stated specifications. And there are reports which should be done that document the particular exercises, projects, or investigations together with these results, conclusions, and recommendations. So if it's not written down, it has never happened. Something which is a little bit special for the FDA CGMP guidelines is a large part on packaging and labeling control. There it is stated that material examinations and usage criteria have to be evaluated. The handling of labeling and packaging material should be documented. The material has to be tested, and the storage of the material has to be also controlled. There are strict guidelines about the issuing of label, and there should be strict control over the exercise of label issuing for use in drug product labeling operations. There shall be procedures in place to ensure that correct labels are used and mix-ups are prevented. And there have to be lot numbers issued to have the possibility to trace the history of each and every lot. And since there has been another incident in the United States in 1902, which are the so-called Chicago Tylenol murders, where people have died due to poisoned Tylenol pills, which have been poisoned after they have been manufactured by the company. And these Tylenol murders are still not solved. In the United States, there are regulations for tamper-evident packaging for over-the-counter drugs. Drug product inspections has to be done for the package and label products shall be examined during finishing operations to provide assurance that containers and packages in the lot have the correct label, and there has to be an expiration date on the package to assure that drug products meet the applicable standards of identity, strength, quality, and purity at the time of use. Another part, which is qualification and validation, is one of the main focuses in both guidelines, and validation is, of course, one main part of all these GMP stuff, if you put it like this. And basically, qualification and validation activities should be planned. This planning should, in the end, lead to a so-called validation master plan. And this validation master plan should consider the whole life cycle of the equipment, but not only the equipment, also of the whole production process. Upon this, requalification of the production equipment and also should be done in regular manner. And one of the main steps is process validation. Maybe you have heard of the 3 production runs which should be done as validation runs before the production process is finally accepted as being GMP. This is how it was before, but right now with the emerging of several new drugs, for instance, as mentioned at the beginning, these ATMPs, advanced therapy medicinal products, or human cell and gene-based therapies, the regulatory authorities came to the conclusion that sometimes it's not easy to do this 3 validation runs, but right now the focus is a little bit changing also to the ability to do in-process validation if in regards of a risk-based approach, the manufacturer of the drug has come to the conclusion that it's easier and would lead to an also high-quality product if they do in-process validation. But the test methods have to be validated, there has to be cleaning validation, and finally, a change control system should be in place to show that changes to the already validated process do not have an impact on the quality of the existing product and existing process, of course. But what else is regulated in the GMP guidelines? As I mentioned before, more or less everything. This is the table of contents of the European guidelines, which I have copied just from the internet. And to show you that it's really more or less everything, I have highlighted a few of the contents. For instance, there are guidelines for the basic requirements for active substances, which are used as starting materials in your process. But not only this, there are guidelines on the manufacturing of liquids, creams, and ointments. And we are still moving on. There are also guidelines on setting health-based exposure limits for use in risk identification in the manufacture of different medicinal products in shared facilities. And last but not least, since I have picked only a few examples, there are also guidelines for the manufacture of veterinary medicinal products other than immunological veterinary medicinal products. And as you might, of course, right now be able to consider for yourself, if there are guidelines for the manufacturing of other than immunological veterinary products, you will most likely find also guidelines on the manufacturing of immunological veterinary medicinal products. So once again, it's more or less all in there. As mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we are doing a webinar series, and the next part of this webinar series will cover the so-called ATMP, Advanced Therapies Medicinal Products, or human cell and gene-based therapy medicinal products, which are at least not as tightly regulated as classical drugs, for instance aspirin, at the moment, but there are right now efforts being done to, since at the moment there are no dedicated regulations for the GMP compliant manufacturing of these ATMPs, there are at the moment efforts being done to regulate these products according to the new needs which are emerge in the manufacturing of these products. I have just copied some of the existing FDA guidances for industries. For instance, there is a draft guidance for industry to show you that it's not completely covered. There is a draft guidance for industry on the deviation reporting for human cells, tissues, and cellular and tissue-based products regulated solely under 361 of the Public Health Service Act and 21 CFR Part 1271, once again draft guidance. There is another draft guidance for the recommendations of microbial vectors used for gene therapy. There is a draft guidance for industry and FDA staff on the manipulation of human cells, tissues, and cellular and tissue-based products. I can go on with this further. For instance, there is a draft guidance for industry on assay development for immunogenicity testing of therapeutic proteins, but still nothing really more or less finalized and nothing which covers the complete process. And since this has come to the attention of the regulatory authorities, not only recently, but 2007, where the European Union released the EC guideline on advanced therapy medicinal products. There's also in this guideline the Article 5 on good manufacturing practice, which stated back then that, and now I'm citing, the Commission shall, after consulting the agency, draw up guidelines in line with the principles of good manufacturing practice and specific to advanced therapy medicinal products. So it was already seen back then that there should be guidelines in place, which are not yet in place. In order to cover this lack of regulation, the European Union started a consultancy process, and right now there's a consultation document in place for the good manufacturing practice of advanced therapy medicinal products. This is the case in the European Union at the moment. As I said, there are many guidelines and draft guidelines which cover parts of the process in the United States, and this is which we are going to cover in our next webinar. And since we have seen this, something which maybe all of us have already learned is that translational research may start already with the most basic research experiment you are doing in your labs. And maybe you're doing experiments which you have never been imagined to become relevant for the clinics, but at least if you are planning to use your research on the way into the clinics, plan ahead and find a partner who can support you through all the way from basic research to the through the preclinical phase until your groundbreaking discovery becomes the day-to-day application in clinical life. And with this, I would like to finish, and I'm happy to take your questions.